What's up, everybody? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining again tonight after what was an epic Formula One weekend full of all the things we love to talk about. Controversy, number one. We'll get into all of that. Wheel-to-wheel racing, a championship decider. I mean, there was everything that we could have possibly wished for and lots of stuff we could have never dreamt could have happened either. Before we start today, I want to say that tonight's show is going to be full of opinions that are going to split the audience down the middle. My opinions, which I'm sure you're looking forward to receiving, I'm looking forward to giving them. Your opinions that I want in return. I want the chat to be full of your opinions on all of this. These are going to be opinions that are backed up by passion, by decisions that you feel went for or against the driver or team that you support. Passionate decisions, passionate conversations are great. I'm really looking forward to having all of those. I want this to be a passionate hour-long show, getting our views across in both directions. What I also want is us all to remain kind. No matter whether the decisions went for you in terms of the driver you support or against you, your grief, your battle, your argument, your anger, if that's what you're feeling, is not with me. It's not with your fellow Formula One supporters, no matter what their opinions are, even if they're not the same as yours. Your anger and your disgruntlement will be with somebody else. It might be with race control. It might be with something else that happened over the course of the weekend. But let's keep that anger and that vociferous rudeness and unkindness that I've seen sweeping across the internet today, directed at all sorts of people. Let's keep it out of this chat. If we can keep it kind, this should be a fantastic hour talking about Formula One. So let's get into it. I'll give you my opinion as an overview of what happened, and then I want all of your views on what I'm saying and your wider views on the weekend as a whole. We've got lots to cover. If you saw my tweet earlier on, there are many topics I want to get through tonight, but we're going to start with the big one. Let's start. This is my take on what happened yesterday as an overall view. This has been an epic season of Formula One. It's been one of the best that I can remember, possibly even the best ever. Two unbelievably good drivers with two unbelievably good teams. As close as you could possibly want. We've been screaming out for a challenge outside of that Mercedes team to come for years. We want somebody to tackle Lewis Hamilton on a level playing field and match him race for race, going wheel to wheel at different circuits throughout the season. And that is exactly what we've got. The season had ups and downs, twists and turns, and it culminated in the final race of the season where both drivers went into it absolutely level on points. Both drivers had their share of good and bad luck. Both drivers had controversial decisions that went for them and against them throughout the season. And in my book, that was relatively even all the way through. As a season as a whole, it played out in the most fair way possible if we take the big picture. Until yesterday. And what happened yesterday shouldn't ever happen, shouldn't ever be allowed to happen again in this sport. Because what happened yesterday was a moment at the end of that Grand Prix that not only changed the championship, and I will talk about that in a moment. Of course it changed the championship outcome, and of course that's the bit that everyone's focusing on. But actually the bigger picture of what happened at the end of yesterday's race is that it was grossly unfair, not just to Lewis Hamilton and to Mercedes, but to the sport. Now, I don't believe there was any predetermined bias in the decision making that went on in race control yesterday, and I'll back that up with examples in a moment. I think there was a horrendous cock-up through indecision and buckling under pressure from various sources coming, whether it be time pressure or the pressure from various team principals screaming into Michael Massey's ear, the pressure of the overall situation of a championship decider coming down to the last few laps. Whatever that pressure and wherever that pressure came from, it seemed to me, and this is just my opinion of course, that Michael Massey, unfortunately for him, buckled under that pressure, and instead of being clear, concise and decisive, which is exactly what that moment required of him, that is his job in that moment, it's what the sport needed from him, he didn't deliver that. He delivered a decision that was somewhere wishy-washy in between the two decisions that could have been made within the framework of the regulations that still you may not have been happy with if it didn't suit your driver, but we wouldn't be having the controversy that we're talking about right now. Michael Masi, I'm sure, will reflect today on what happened yesterday and will be in the most distraught situation. You know, I don't believe that we should come down on Michael Masi like a ton of bricks calling for his head. I believe he made a mistake. But every single one of us watching this show has made mistakes in our lives. Some of them will be big. What we need to do from this point onwards is obviously learn what happened, learn why it happened, and put things in place to make sure it can't happen again. And when I said at the top of this show, what happened yesterday should never be allowed to happen in Formula One again, that is exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to come to some of your comments on what I've just said, and then we'll start picking out the bones of it, because there's so much more nuance, so much more detail to get into, but that's my overriding view of what went on yesterday evening. So I'll come to you and let's see what you've got to say, and then we'll pick out some of your questions, some of your comments, and I'll try and clarify my take on some of those too. So let's see what we've got then. Right, so first of all, Masi's made a lot of mistakes over this season. He can't seem to handle the pressure. Now, I want to pick up on that one straight away, and I've just done a slot on Talk Sport a moment ago before I came on air on the radio to talk about these exact same things. Lots of people immediately calling for Michael Masi's head. Now, you can call for Michael Masi to lose his job. You can shout and say that he's not fit for purpose. He's not fit for that role. But let's just look at exactly where we're getting that from. Yes, yesterday he made a mistake. I mean, I'm the first to say that was a horrendous cock-up. But people are also lumping Michael Masi in with many of the decisions and the penalties that were handed out over the course of this season that they may not agree with. Those penalties and those decisions that came out the stewards' room did not come from Michael Masi. So let's not confuse the two. Yes, Michael Masi has, I think, made poor decisions at various points this season. Spa was one. Brazil, I think, together with the stewards, was perhaps another one. But the penalties that you may agree or disagree with didn't come from Michael Masi. They came from the stewards, which is a separate group of people. So whilst we can disagree with some of the things Michael Masi has done, let's not confuse that issue by lumping in all the things that we disagree with. And there were lots of stewarding decisions that I think lots of people take issue with. Let's not lump the two in together. That's my first thought before we start calling for Michael Masi's head, saying he's made mistakes all season. I think we need to take that with a slight pinch of salt. That, by the way, is an incredibly difficult role, an incredibly difficult job. And yesterday, it was possibly the hardest job in Formula One. Building up to yesterday, can you imagine the pressure that he and the stewards must have felt? Particularly given the increased access we now have to him and that group in race control through broadcast radio communications and etc. That was a very difficult task. The last thing he wanted was for a decision at race control to come down to those final moments that could shape the outcome. And that's exactly what happened, and it felt like he got that decision wrong. Right, lots of you calling for Michael Masi to go. Of course, I understand the frustration. I understand why people are saying that. But is the alternative to that not learning from what happened and not finding a way to support Michael Masi through perhaps an increased resource in race control, more people, better structure, more data available to him, more systems? Perhaps there are many things in terms of technology that could help to support that decision making. I mean, I was talking to somebody earlier on at one of the teams, and you know what they were saying was when they have a split-second decision to make, which of course happens all the time up and down that pit lane, they're not making that on their own. They're making that in most cases with the help of a computer system, a system that predicts the potential outcomes of various situations and throws up the solution onto a screen. So the strategists up and down Formula One's pit lane that are making these decisions about when to pit, when not to pit, which tyres to go on, in most cases it's the computer that's actually making those decisions in split seconds. And of course the strategists have to interpret that and do their best to relay that information in the right way and to eventually make that decision. Michael Masi doesn't have those kind of systems, so maybe there are ways that we can support him, or that the sport can support him with better technology, better resources, perhaps more people, before we just immediately say he's got to go. Now, I know that many of you are going to disagree with that. Many of you are disagreeing with that. But let's look at alternatives as well as just saying he's got to go. Because who else are you going to put in? And if you do put somebody else in, they're going to be faced with the same kind of problems that Michael Masi is faced with. He's actually a very nice guy. He's actually a calm, level-headed guy. And actually, I don't know him incredibly well, but I've met him a number of times. And I would say he feels like the kind of person that would remain calm under pressure. But yesterday was an extreme level of pressure. And perhaps you'll find many other people would have reacted in a similar way. Who knows? Right, it's all about consistency. So there's a good point that I've just picked out there. And that, I think, is where most people have issues here with Michael Masi and the stewards as a whole. And I'll probably put more of this on the stewards in terms of handing out penalties when it comes to consistency. But look, let's take another example from yesterday's Grand Prix. And this is the example that I think backs up the idea that bucks this viewpoint that many people have, that this was all orchestrated to make sure that Lewis Hamilton didn't win the championship. Or this was orchestrated to make sure that given Max was on the soft tyres at the end, he could have this great shot at overtaking Lewis and we get a brand new world champion. I don't buy any of that. That's not part of what I've interpreted from any of what's happened over the course of this season. Many of you may well disagree. But look, this is how I back this up. On lap 1 of that Grand Prix, when Lewis Hamilton was overtaken by Max Verstappen in a bold move, lunged down the inside. I thought a fair move, borderline, but I thought was fair. Lewis Hamilton went off the racetrack. Now, Lewis Hamilton went off the racetrack partly because Max Verstappen ran him out of road, but actually much more so because there was racetrack to run out on. If that was a gravel track, you bet your bottom dollar Lewis Hamilton would not have ended up in it. He'd have backed out of the overtake, he'd have backed out of the challenge, and he'd have followed around behind Max. He had that option available to him. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Lewis goes off the track, cuts the corner, gains a huge advantage, and in my view, and I think in the view of most people, didn't give that advantage back after he was requested to do so from the stewards. Now, if you are Michael Masi and you've got this big game plan to ensure that it's all hinged towards Max Verstappen becoming world champion, you don't make that decision, do you? You make sure in that early call that Lewis is forced to give the place back to Max. That's in the early part of the race. No one knows how the rest of the race is going to play out. It wouldn't have probably made any difference anyway to the pace differential between the two. But that doesn't make sense to somebody who's trying to orchestrate a Max Verstappen win, does it? So that's my point on all of that. Consistency, though, you're right, is what everybody wants. It's what the sport needs. And maybe there has to be better ways that we can ensure consistency happens through a different or a more clear framework in terms of issuing penalties, but also around things like overtaking moves and certainly around some of these very complex rules that came into question yesterday. Right, let's come back to you. Was he instructed to give it back? No. So Jim says, was he instructed to give the place back? No, he wasn't, but he was instructed to give back the advantage that he got on that first lap. So the idea being that he gained a huge advantage by cutting the corner, even though he was in front, he remained in front. And it was a very strange scenario because Mercedes suggested they'd given that advantage back in that Lewis had backed up a little bit towards Max, but clearly he hadn't given the advantage back because at the moment the infringement happened, if it wasn't indeed an infringement, they were neck to neck, they were wheel to wheel. So that was a strange one that's, paled into insignificance with what happened later in the race, wasn't it? Right, what else are we saying here? Hold on. If Mercedes, okay, where's that gone? If Mercedes wins in court, does the FIA reimburse Mercedes? Does the lap get counted back? What could the court decide? So here's a good point, right? And I know we're jumping around here, but I'm just taking the questions. I knew it was going to be like this. It was going to be a frantic show. We've got a lot to get through. I'm just jumping in as and when the chat rolls through. I'm picking out questions. This idea of what on earth happens, right? So the first thing, let's broaden this out a little bit. In that mistake that I believe Michael Masi made in that decision-making process, in allowing 5 cars to unlap themselves, then pull the safety car in and let's go racing for one final lap. Firstly, I believe he did all that with the right intentions. And as I'm sure you've heard and read today, there's been a long-standing mutual agreement from all the teams with a mandate to the race director to do whatever he can at the end of a Grand Prix to have it finish under green flag, under green racing rather than behind a safety car. That is what I believe Michael Masi was desperate to try and do. I don't believe he was desperately trying to set up a Max Verstappen win. I don't believe that for a second. He was trying to follow through on that mandate and not have this championship and this race be decided or finished rather under a safety car. So that's the first thing, and I believe that's why he made that decision. Then, of course, there's this whole issue of if he did breach the rules or certainly not follow the rules that were in place, and there's lots of arguments that you'll have seen that various rules outrank other rules, and this overriding rule that essentially means the race director has control over the safety car's deployment and retraction, kind of overriding everything. It's a bit of a wishy-washy get out of jail free card that they have dug up from the regulations once I believe they've realised they've kind of messed up when it got into the stewards room post-race. What was going to be the outcome of that? Because who do you penalise? As you rightly say there, no one on the racetrack is at fault. Max Verstappen did nothing wrong yesterday. Lewis Hamilton did nothing wrong yesterday. Neither of the two teams on track did anything wrong either. It was race control, the guys who are supposed to be enforcing their own rules, that kind of messed it up. So who do you penalise? And if you can't penalise somebody, how do you make this fair again? And there was always this argument about going back and taking a race result from a lap earlier. There is precedent for that kind of thing happening, not because of this kind of incident, but we have shortened a race when the flag has come out at the wrong moment and various things. If a red flag happens, we often take the race results from the end of the preceding lap to the red flag. So there are kind of precedents that could have happened. And maybe that was the potential outcome that, of course, Mercedes were hoping for. But now it's gone beyond that. They've rejected that appeal. It now goes to, they've rejected that protest. It now goes to appeal with the FIA. My feeling is that will probably be rejected as well. And then the only other possible recourse that Mercedes would have is to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is a big, big deal. And this, I believe, wouldn't be about trying to get their hands necessarily just on that trophy, but much more about shaping the way this sport is governed in the future. Doing what's right, making sure that the teams and drivers are operating on a fair and level playing field, which is what some people feel didn't happen yesterday. And I can understand that frustration, particularly from Mercedes. But actually, it wasn't just from Mercedes, was it? If we think about one of the main reasons I have a massive issue with what Michael Masi did yesterday wasn't just about how it affected the championship, because in reality, you can't make these decisions, rightly or wrongly, you can't make them based on the outcome of a championship. You have to take it as an incident in a race. And if you thought about yesterday as maybe race 2 of the championship, if exactly the same thing played out again on race 2, would we be having the same conversation? Would they have made the same decisions? Would Michael Masi have made different decisions because maybe he wouldn't be under so much pressure? Quite possibly. But the decision that was made shouldn't be about the fact there's a championship at stake. Yes, you can base it on the fact that there's a race at stake and we're coming to the closing section of that race and maybe you want to get some racing laps in before the end. That's all great, that's all understandable stuff. But the decision that was made yesterday seemed based solely around those two drivers. And that, even bigger than how it affected the championship, is fundamentally wrong for me. Michael Masi released 5 lapped cars to unlap themselves for the pure and simple reason to allow Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton to race each other to the flag. Whether you believe that's for the championship or decided for the championship or just because it's the end of a race, he picked those two drivers to focus on and made rules up to suit their battle. Well, what about a Carlos Sainz, who was currently 3rd but with Valtteri Bottas behind him and now has lapped cars still in front of him that weren't allowed to unlap themselves? What about him? What if we are in race 2 for the championship where potentially at that stage Carlos Sainz could be a championship contender? Who knows? And yet his race has been massively hampered. What about the cars that weren't allowed to unlap themselves and the inter-team battles that they might have been having with other drivers further down the grid? It still can have an impact on your constructor's finishing position and therefore prize money. Their races were hugely impacted by the fact that 3 cars were not allowed to unlap themselves, and yet the 3 or 5 cars ahead of them were allowed to unlap themselves. That's grossly unfair in any sporting context. So you take the championship away, this decision was grossly unfair. And that, for me, is the biggest mistake that Michael Masi made. He took his eye off being a race director and had it focused solely on 2 championship contenders. And you can't do that as race director. That's favouring the rules and the interpretation of those rules to suit 2 people on that racetrack, ignoring the other 15 or so that were still out there. And that, I think, is a horrific mix-up and a horrific cock-up on their part. Right, let's come back to you guys. Sorry about that. I'm going on a right old rant tonight. Okay, let me... right, lots of you still saying Masi should be fired. Okay, I mean, as I said, I totally understand that opinion. I would take a slightly different one, and I would, he's very new to this job. He's come in under very difficult circumstances, and I would take a different view. People make mistakes. People make horrendous mistakes. I've been in a Formula One team where mistakes that people make can similarly affect race wins or losses and affect championships. You don't get fired because you don't get a wheel on properly in a pit stop, or because you don't do a wheel nut up properly. You don't get fired for that. The person who makes that mistake has to be central to forming a solution that will then ensure that mistake doesn't happen again, to making the team stronger. And I believe Michael Masi, together with the rest of the stewarding group, together with the teams, can be central to the way that we ensure that this kind of cock-up can't happen again. That would be my view on it. And apart from that, who else are you going to put in? The FIA sporting regs need a complete rewrite, and I'm even a Max fan, says Brian Ferguson. And that, I would partly agree with. I don't think they need a complete rewrite. I mean, they're getting something of a rewrite anyway for next year, but there are definitely a number of areas that can do with clarification or clearing up, simplifying to some extent. It's a very complex sport, and it's all very well saying let's write a set of very simple rules. When you do that, you can start like that, and then you can run for 2 or 3 seasons, and every time you get an incident, another variation of that regulation or a directive that has to follow those regulations comes in to deal with a nuance that's crept up that you didn't predict. And then before long, you end up with a very complex set of regulations. That's kind of what's happened. We can simplify many of them. Some of these regulations have been in for many years and are not necessary. In fact, the very regulation, I forget if it's 48.12 or 48.13, I'm sure you've all read that regulation a number of times over the course of yesterday and today. But one of those regulations states that the safety car, after allowing lapped cars to unlap themselves, should then pit at the end of the following lap. Well, we don't need that regulation. That's a sort of a perfect example that we could take that out and we could rewrite that in a much simpler way. We could allow the safety car to pit at the end of, or pit whenever it's safe to do so. For example, we could allow the lapped cars, instead of having to overtake and complete the right run around the entire track to join the back of the field, we could allow them to sort of drop back to the back of the pack. There are lots of new ways that we could interpret finding solutions to problems we have or challenges we have in Formula One. We don't have to rely on a legacy set of regulations, many of which have been in place for many, many, many years. So I agree with you, whoever said that, Brian Ferguson. We could definitely do with looking at the sporting regulations with a fresh blank canvas, and they don't all need to go, but I do think we could have a fresh set of eyes on them and tidy some of them up. And yesterday was a good example of that. So yeah, I think let's leave that one there. Right. We could also focus on the rules as they are, says A. Bailey. Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, I think that the confusion that came when it came to those rules was that Michael Masi, I believe, got caught in between 2 minds. Obviously, with hindsight, the best solution to what happened yesterday would have been to throw a red flag. Stop the race, clear up the mess, and do a restart where both drivers and all teams are allowed to change tyres in the pit lane, as we know they are, and have a 2 or 3 lap sprint, at the end of the Grand Prix. That would have been a really exciting finish. It would have been box office. Probably still Lewis would have won because he had the faster car, which would have been a fair result. And I don't think anyone would have complained. But when you don't throw a red flag, when Michael is throwing a safety car because perhaps at that point he doesn't know whether he can get that mess cleared away relatively quickly, it's one of those borderline decisions. I don't think we should come down too harshly on any of those calls, because ultimately safety is at the heart of what everything Michael Masi should be doing, and that has to be his primary focus. Throwing a safety car, I don't think there was anything wrong with that decision. I don't think we should criticise that too much. It was what happened after that in his desperate attempt to get racing happening again, where things just went horribly wrong, and it as I said, it felt like he got caught in two minds and ended up with a decision that was somewhere split between the two probable outcomes that would have been better. Right. Massey's too slow on red flags. No, I'm not sure on that. I don't think so. No, I'm not buying that. I think most of those safety decisions, I think Michael Masi has been pretty good on. This is a human being who's going to have good days and bad days. He's going to make some mistakes, or he's going to make some calls that you or I will disagree with. And that will always be the nature. That was actually the nature when it was Charlie Whiting doing that job. It was, there were lots of things that Charlie Whiting did that we as fans disagreed with. There were lots that the teams disagreed with. But, we look back on the Charlie Whiting era with rose-tinted glasses to some extent, because it was a very different era. We didn't have anywhere near the access. I've got to give massive respect and credit to Michael Masi in the way that he's taken on this role, stepped up into very big shoes, taken on a very difficult job, in a very difficult period, by the way, during the sort of COVID era. And he's been very open, and he's come out and been quite honest. He's dealt with the media when he hasn't had to. He's come out to explain decisions that he and the stewards have made at certain racetracks. That's, I think, a welcome addition in most part. Even if you don't agree with his explanation, he's been bold enough and brave enough to step up and do that in many places. So we've got to give him plenty of credit where credit's due, and not just lump him in with a bad decision or a decision that you think was wrong and say he's done loads of those, he's got to go, he's not as good as Charlie Whiting. He may be or he may not be. The sport has moved on a lot. Michael Masi is a very different human being, taking a very different view on how this sport is governed from a race director perspective. It's also a slightly different role to Charlie. Charlie was in an era where he was actually doing more than one role from his position, whereas with Michael Masi, he is solely the race director. Charlie was also the technical delegate as well, which meant that he had a very different perspective on many of these things. So it is a different role. It's a different person doing that role, and I think we have to give him some space to grow into it. Yes, I think he massively messed up yesterday, but just take a moment to, have a little bit of compassion to spare a thought for how he's feeling today. The whole world, and I've seen some horrific journalism across the tabloid papers and on social media, if you can call that journalism, centred around Michael Masi, even around Nicholas Latifi, believe it or not. Unbelievable stuff. I mean, it's disgraceful, some of the things I've read. So spare a thought for how those guys are feeling. Spare a thought for how their actions have been magnified across the world. And yes, how they've changed a championship in favour of one team over the other. Not, I believe, deliberately for that purpose, but that's the outcome that it's had. I've got to say, I feel horrendously sorry for Michael Masi this morning, given the way situations have played out and the way people are reporting it and the way the world seems to have turned against him so vociferously. Right. Could we have had joint world champions? No. I mean, it crossed my mind, but, that's a very strange scenario. This is a sport. We need a winner. That's the whole nature of sport. And, that wouldn't have even been fair, really, to the two guys battling for this championship. There was no fair outcome at the end of yesterday after what happened. It was a cock-up and unfortunately become incredibly messy. But neither driver and neither team did anything wrong in that scenario. So it's a very strange one, an unprecedented scenario, and a very difficult one to now sort out, as I say. Right, we're half an hour in. Right, is 1 hour going to be enough? Yeah, that's a good point. Right, please talk about the race from Lewis's point of view. Well, okay, let's talk about the race from both drivers' perspective. Let's talk about Lewis first of all, because In fact, there's a couple of points I want to make here. Lewis Hamilton obviously drove an impeccable race yesterday. He got a blistering start, beat Max on that softer tyre, not something that anyone expected to happen. He was the quicker driver with the quicker car, and he didn't put a foot wrong yesterday. Lewis, of all drivers, I mean, literally didn't put a foot wrong. He played the race perfectly. He managed his tyres on a very long stint towards the end, and unfortunately he was slightly hampered in terms of the strategy calls that they were sort of forced into making as the race played out. The start for Lewis was brilliant. I thought the incident at was it turn 5 on the first lap, I thought that was dubious, but look, we've had moments in Brazil where Max got away with similarly dubious actions. The difference with this one was that Lewis clearly gained an advantage whilst being off track, and normally that is a slam dunk. You must give that place back, and that didn't happen. So that was a weird one. But, after all of that, Lewis just drove away and drove his race, a clean race, did everything he had to do. The championship was in the bag for him. So understandably, you would say, he will feel incredibly hard done by. And with that in mind, how classy was Lewis Hamilton at the end of that race? What an incredible competitor to get out of his car despite surely feeling anger, disappointment, bewilderment. I mean, all manner of emotions at the end of that World Championship battle. It's a long battle. It's an intense battle. These guys, together with their teams, put everything on the line for a World Championship, particularly in those closing races of a season. And yet he stepped out of the car, congratulated Max and his team, talked about his own team in the highest possible regard, and didn't once actually complain during his immediate post-race interviews about decisions from the stewards. I thought that was an absolute brilliant window into the world of Lewis Hamilton and his mindset. It perhaps comes with his experience, but it's also a measure of the man. He's a classy guy. He goes about his racing in the right way. And none of this is to the detriment of Max Verstappen, by the way. I'm just at the moment describing, the actions of a Lewis Hamilton that, I was very fortunate to work with at a moment when this whole scenario kind of played out in reverse, where a decision by somebody else in 2008 that was an incorrect, a poor decision, Timo Glock and his team to stay out on those slick tyres as the rain came down in Brazil, and that benefited Lewis Hamilton on that final lap of that final season and us. We won the championship because of a decision somebody else had kind of got wrong. And, in that moment, the world turned against Timo Glock as some kind of, imaginary enemy. He's had abuse for years following that, which is why I cannot believe people are turning on Nicholas Latifi in the same way. It's just mind-boggling that people do that kind of thing. But Lewis Hamilton was epic yesterday in all senses, in and out of the car. He is a worthy 7-time world champion. He would have been a worthy 8-time world champion. And he's just, the class of the field in the overall package. One thing I thought was really interesting about Lewis Hamilton, and I put this in my little Twitter summary earlier on, what do we think about the interview that Lewis gave when asked about next year? Does anybody believe there might have been somewhere in the line a plan that if Lewis had won that 8th world title, he was potentially considering retiring and not coming back next year? There was a moment in that interview where he was asked about next year and coming back stronger, and I think his response was something along the lines of, well, we'll see about next year. Of course, that could be just adrenaline and emotion talking, but I interviewed Nico Rosberg 2 days after he won his World Championship in 2016, and one of the questions I asked him was, are you planning on putting the number 1 on the car for next season, or are you going to stick with your own number? And he came up with a series of slightly awkward ways to evade the question, and of course I didn't think anything of it at the time, but when Lewis Hamilton was asked yesterday about next season, he did exactly the same kind of thing. He awkwardly talked about a couple of random topics that weren't part of the question and then slightly evaded what might happen next year. Now, I know he's got a contract. I don't believe really that that's ever part of the plan that Lewis was going to give up. But does anybody believe that that might be something that could be on his mind? Was it even just on his mind off the back of what happened with the dismay at what he just faced? I'd love to know your views on all of that. So let's have a look. Let's jump back in here. Let me see. Is anybody saying anything about that? Let's see. Would not blame him for retiring because it is less and less a sport. And perhaps that's where that sentiment came from. Perhaps it was dismay at what he just witnessed that he wasn't willing to openly commit to next year. I don't know. I don't think I really believe that he's thinking of retiring. But if he'd had an 8th world title in his pocket yesterday, finally got that record that he's been searching for, could that have been the trigger? Could that have been the thing that just tipped him over the edge and thought, do you know what, I just can't do that again? It's what happened to Nico Rosberg. Nico Rosberg had no intention of retiring until he got to the latter stages of that season when it drained him so much and took so much out of him that he felt he couldn't come back and give that again. I wonder. I think Lewis will smash next year, says Jason Morgan. I mean, personally, I think he will. I think that's how he'll do it. He'll bounce back. He'll come back stronger. He has an amazing knack of turning these situations that seemingly go against him, turning a negative into a positive and using that to generate energy. That's what I firmly believe will happen next year. He'll use this anger, if that's what he's feeling, this fight that he feels like he's taking on the world, and he'll put that into a championship challenge perhaps next year. Maybe. It'd be great to see, wouldn't it? Oh, hi Lexi Priestley. That's my daughter. Hey Dad. Hello from Spain. Nice, thanks for tuning in. Right, where else are we going? Right, tell you what, shall we talk about, as we've talked about Lewis Hamilton's race, should we just talk about Max Verstappen's race, and then we'll get into some of the other talking points. And look, if we have to run over 10 o'clock, I mean, maybe we have to do that. I always said I would stick to an hour. Maybe there's too much to talk about tonight. We'll see. Max Verstappen. Max almost didn't put a foot wrong yesterday. Max Verstappen did almost everything right. And the only thing that I can see that he didn't do right yesterday was the start of the race. And that's been kind of typical over the last few races, hasn't it? He had the softer tyre, the faster tyre that should have given him a few metres of advantage as the lights went out, and yet he got too much wheel spin, he bogged down, and Lewis was able to take the lead. Max's entire race strategy yesterday was based on getting ahead at the start, trying to build a bit of a gap in the early phase when he had a tyre advantage, and then coming in for that early stop, and that all went out the window right from the moment the lights went out. Do I think it would have changed the outcome? I really don't. I think Lewis had too much performance in hand. And do you know what? Actually, it was the fact that Max was the chasing car, the fact that he was second as that entire race played out in the latter stages, that equally allowed him the opportunity to take those gambles on tyre strategy. At the virtual safety car, where he came in for that free pit stop with a big gap behind, and again when the safety car came out with 5 laps to go, it was that fact that he was the chase car, he was in second place, that gave him the freedom to make that call. Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, well, they just couldn't do that at the end. There was no way Mercedes could have stopped for soft tyres. It wasn't an option for them, because if they'd done that, Max would have done the opposite. Max would have stayed out, he'd have had track position, and then it was a gamble on what would have happened towards the end of the race. It was such a borderline call as to whether we would get any racing happening again, and no team, no software could have predicted that with any accuracy. It was right on the cusp, as we saw with the decision-making process that then ensued. It was right on the cusp of being a safety car finish, have a couple of laps of racing, and that borderline hairline decision was, you know, one way it would have favoured the guy behind the soft tyres, the other it would have favoured the guy who stayed out and maintained track position. So Mercedes did the right thing. It was the only thing they could do. But being second, of course, Max had that freedom to go and play that gamble, play that sort of gambling card in that moment, and ultimately it ended up winning the race. So Max Verstappen drove as well as he could yesterday. It was a typical Max race, wasn't it? When he had the opportunities, he took them. They were bold lunges on many occasions. They were aggressive, but that's Max. And I personally, I've talked about this many times, I don't think we should be trying to curtail that. We want safety at all times, and we want good racing. But for me, that was great racing yesterday. Between Max and Lewis on the first lap, fine, great racing. Between Checo Perez and Lewis Hamilton, and by the way, how unbelievably good was Checo in that battle with Lewis. That was great racing between those two at that stage of the race. It was hard, it was wheel to wheel, it was aggressive, you know, on both sides. but fair. And that was just brilliant stuff, I thought. And then again on the final lap, the overtake from Max was aggressive again. It was bold, but it was clean, and it was a fair move. And when Lewis tried to come back, it was the same. They were wheel to wheel, almost touching, the two best drivers in the world, in the two best cars in the world, millimetres apart on that final lap. And that, for me, is exactly what we want. I don't want to see Max Verstappen pegged back in terms of his driving style too much. Of course, there has to be a line, and that's what we need to really clearly define as the regulations move forward. What is that line? And if he steps over it, if anyone steps over it, what is going to be the punishment? That needs to be clear. It's been unclear this season, and that's my biggest issue. We've had inconsistency, as somebody mentioned earlier. So, look, I thought both drivers drove impeccably well, and neither of them did anything wrong in terms of the way this championship unfolded in the end. And it's important to say, this championship wasn't won or lost yesterday. No championship is ever won or lost yesterday. Like no race is won or lost in the first corner, it's over the entirety of the Grand Prix. No championship is won in any one race. We can look back over this 22 race season and pick out many, many incidents and say, well, look, Max was unlucky when Lewis, knocks him off at Silverstone, got a penalty, but then still went on to win the race. You could say Max was unlucky when it came to the puncher at Baku, when he would have undoubtedly won that Grand Prix. There are moments that you can pick out for both drivers when, Lewis knocked his brake magic on at Baku by mistake, an unlucky mistake. These things happen all the way through every championship, and both teams can pick out many of those things that could have impacted and did impact the way the championship played out. But it got to that final round with them level on points, so it felt like it all came down. It was all based around one race, and of course in the closing moments it was, but the bigger championship was never just won or lost yesterday. It was won over the course of the season, and that's an important point to remember. I'll see here. Right, this is what I disagree with here. Dragonfly Sutra. Max behaved with no dignity with an inherited win. Disagree wholeheartedly, in fact. I thought, I don't think you can say Max behaved with no dignity. I think actually both teams, and that's their drivers at times, their team principals, certainly their groups of fans, behaved with a lack of dignity at various points in the season. It got personal at times throughout this season. Both drivers questioned decisions openly from the stewards and from the race direction. Both drivers questioned each other and their behaviour. Team principals did the same. It got nasty and personal, and that was a side of the sport this year that was a shame to see, but perhaps indicative of just how intense the battle was. We haven't seen a battle this intense between two teams for many, many years. And that's perhaps what you get. That passion began to overflow. So again, don't want to curtail that too much, because I love the fact that this was such a passionately fought season, both on the track, off the track, and across the world between sets of fans. What I don't like is when it gets over the top of that and it gets nasty, it gets rude, it gets very, very unpleasant. And, people I've seen blaming the media for that. Well, if people saying to me today, of course fans are going to get nasty with each other, because of course they're going to hate the other driver because the media have played it out that way. Have your own minds. That's rubbish. I'm sorry. Yes, the media do hype things up, and as I said, there's been some horrific journalism over the course of the last 24 hours. But have your own minds, guys. Come on, we can behave in a way that we think is right. We don't have to follow a narrative that some TV director or newspaper editor has decided that's the narrative they want to play out. So it's been one of those seasons. I think both drivers would have been very, very worthy champions, and the fact that we couldn't split them on points going to the final round kind of sums it up. Right, where are we going next? Let's go. Perez. Perez showed that contrary to Max, he knows how to be aggressive yet fair, and that's how the battle goes a couple of turns. That's how the battle goes for a couple of turns. I don't think Max was at all unfair yesterday in the racing. I mean, does anyone disagree that anything Max did on track yesterday was unfair? I mean, I really don't. I think his move on Lewis was exactly what we want a Formula One driver to do. We don't want this. We don't want them to be too polite, saying, you know, after you and no, after you. No, after you. We want drivers to be aggressive. And I thought it was great. I don't think Max did anything that was unfair yesterday. Perez was spectacular, absolutely brilliant in that battle. So again, in a similar way, I thought it was a really great battle. That last lap, by the way, between Max and Lewis, Max with a car that was inherently faster but on slower tyres, was just brilliant. Lewis wasn't going to give it up, and he gave it everything right to the death. But so did Max, and it was a sort of microcosm for the season, wasn't it? That final lap, in that they were both battling wheel to wheel. Then one would get past again. Lewis wasn't going to let him go, and it was just an epic end. It was just a shame that the reason we got that end was through a massive kerfuffle in race control. Is Lewis going to drive with number 2 on his car next year? No, it doesn't work like that. So the numbers on the cars in the modern era of the sport, Lewis will drive with 44 on his car next year. The only person who has the opportunity to change that number is Max Verstappen, who has the ability, if he wants, within the regulations, to put the number 1 on his car. I don't know if he's going to do that or not. I'm not sure if he's mentioned it, if he said it, but the champion has the ability, or the allowance, if he wants, to put the number 1 on the car. In the old days, if he did that, and in fact in the old days he had to do that, the champion would have number 1, his teammate would have number 2. But those days are gone. Everyone has their own personal number. Max can stick with his number 33, or he could choose to have number 1 as champion. Both teams deserve a title, and both got one. I mean, that's one way to look at it, JD. Both teams did deserve it, and that's the overriding feeling here. Look, this was an epic season. Can we just appreciate what an amazing season we've had here? I saw somebody earlier saying, you know, how can people be saying this is the best season Formula One's had? I don't know if it's the best season ever, but it's certainly the best season that I can remember for many, many years. 2007 was an epic season. 2008 was a spectacular season. And there have been others that have gone to the wire, but I don't think any have been fought this passionately and this fiercely on and off track between perhaps the 2 best drivers out there, in 2 cars that were completely different to each other, had very different strengths and weaknesses, and at some circuits one was clearly faster than the other, and yet at another racetrack the opposite car might have a massive advantage. That was a really nice way to go racing. Hopefully we'll get more of that as these new regulations play out and bring the field potentially a little bit closer together. But let's appreciate for a moment, despite all the controversy, what a fantastic season this has been. I hope nobody can disagree with that. How about Carlos on the podium? Ferrari beat McLaren to P3. Fernando's great season and the new car and tyres. So that's a lot to get through, John Gordon, but thank you. Carlos on the podium I thought was brilliant. What a great season Carlos Sainz has had. First season at Ferrari, to go in and beat Charles Leclerc in the way that he's done over the course of a season is brilliant. I thought he's really shone there. He looks like a team leader, and this is a guy that's gone into a team that kind of already had a team leader in Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz looks and is acting and behaving, conducting himself like a team leader. Both drivers at Ferrari are strong, and if they can come up with a decent package next year, they are in with a good shout. Disappointing season, I suppose, from Leclerc in many regards. He wasn't consistent enough, but Carlos Sainz really, really good. And as a result of having those 2 good drivers and the developments they made with their car over the year, Ferrari, you know, made a strong finish to the season and, yes, dominated McLaren in the latter stages. So shame for my boys and girls at McLaren, but you know, fair play to Ferrari. They did a better job in the second half of the season. Max is going to change number 1. Lots of people saying, so maybe he has said that. I didn't see it. Alex Lamas very kindly says, hit the like button. I'd be very grateful if you could do that. Hit the like button, that'd be fantastic. By the way, if you're not subscribed to the channel, I'd also love it if you could do that. You know, it's tailed off the end of this season with my content on this channel. There is going to be more coming in 2022. I've got a very busy life, and that's why things here have had to take a slight back seat, but there's more coming. So just click that subscribe button. And if there's some fantastic content coming your way in 22, you won't miss it. Right, science didn't have a fair opportunity yesterday. Yes, I mean, look, I touched on this earlier. That's as I said, my biggest gripe. The fact that the cars in front of Carlos Sainz weren't allowed to unlap themselves meant that Carlos didn't get a shot at P2, for example. Now, probably he wasn't going to get involved in that title fight. He wasn't quick enough, really, to get involved in the title fight. But that's not the race director's call to make that decision. Oh, I'll tell you what else we need to talk about. We need to talk about the team principals being on the radio to Michael Massey as part of this decision-making process, or as part of a Grand Prix. It's a horrific, and we talked about this last week, those who were with me last week. I just don't think we should be hearing those conversations through the broadcast. But actually, I don't think those conversations, in the way they were happening yesterday, should be happening. I said to you last week, having been involved in the sport and been in a team for many, many years, these conversations have happened for years. The two-way conversation between the team's pit walls and the race director are constant. They've always happened. What you saw and heard yesterday, and in most races this season, is the TV director's choice of radio snippets that they decide are worthy of playing out. And they make that decision, of course, based on an entertainment factor. How much of an entertainment factor is it going to be to our broadcast if we play you, Christian Horner, screaming at Michael Massey about getting the cars to unlap themselves? Obviously, that's going to make the broadcast. There'll be plenty of other conversations and parts of conversations that we don't get to hear or didn't get to hear yesterday. And the danger of all of that is that it builds a narrative for the millions of people watching that then bubbles over into hatred and anger and all the rest of it that we've seen spilling out today. I don't think the race director should be being lobbied, the referee essentially being lobbied by the teams up and down the pit lane. It's a horrendous state of affairs. That should never, of course, be allowed to happen. And that is something that needs to happen, not just because it's wrong, but that's one of those elements that I think, as I said earlier, we could help Michael Massey with in future, or the race director. We could support him in that way by removing some of that external pressure that's unnecessary and, quite frankly, not sportsmanlike and in no way helpful to Michael Massey, whose primary directive is around safety when there's been a massive crash on the racetrack. So that, I think, has to change, got to change. So yeah, that was a real shame to hear those things. As we talked about before, we shouldn't hear them anyway, but actually they shouldn't be happening in the way they're happening. Michael Massey has to be able to talk to the team principals, or to the team pit walls rather. They have to have a way to come back at that with conversations that just need to happen, but it shouldn't be about lobbying for decisions. We had Toto lobbying for a full safety car, not for a full safety car earlier on. We had Christian lobbying to get the cars unlapped. It shouldn't be happening at all. It's not part of sport, it shouldn't be part of sport, and it's definitely not helpful to the way that Michael Massey, or whoever it is able to make those high pressure decisions. Right, totally agree. How could he make a good decision when being barked at from both team bosses? Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that yesterday was the most angry, obviously, because the stakes were high, but it happens all the time, and I don't think it should. So yes, that's an easy one to change, really. Right, I still want to talk about Kimi before we go. What else do we want to talk about? Can you comment on Honda's achievement over the 7 years in F1 and catching Mercedes? Yeah, massive respect and shout out to Honda, because they stuck with their programme when they were in the darkest of days at McLaren, when things just were going horrifically badly, when they had multiple world champions ridiculing their engines, their power units in public over the team radio. The team at McLaren were pretty disparaging about their engine partner Honda. They ended agreements early. It was it would have been a very easy decision for Honda to walk away at that point, citing the fact that they were investing hundreds of millions in this sport and getting nothing but negative publicity in return. That would have been an almost justifiable decision to make, but they didn't. And I massively respect the fact they didn't. They kept working at it. They kept going until they found solutions to their problems. They kept developing and they formed this partnership with Red Bull And I'm so pleased for them that they managed to get a championship under their belt before officially retiring next year. That was a massive reward for a group of people that, I hold in very high regard, the team at Honda. Even the people at McLaren who worked with them, despite the performance of their engines, in terms of the way they worked, their work ethic at Honda was impeccable. And I think people have massive respect for that. So I think, huge respect to them. They have exited this sport, sort of, with the highest possible reward in a World Championship. And I think that will be, something that they'll make them and the entire team incredibly proud. They're a proud nation of people. They're a very proud group at Honda, and that hard work that they put in over those long, dark years has rewarded them with some big prizes. So well done to Honda, absolutely. Right, last of the 16-inch tyres. 16-inch tyres. Yeah, new era for the sport next year. Technically, brand new cars, brand new wheels and tyres. I think that's a fascinating element to Formula One next year, and a real big unknown. We don't know who's going to be quickest. I've said many times, I still think the big teams will be the big teams. I still think the Mercedes, the Red Bulls, the Ferraris, maybe the McLarens, will be up there because they have the best resources and facilities and the best people, typically up and down the grid. And when you have that combination of things, you tend to make the best decisions when a new set of rules comes out. But there's still this massive unknown that somebody anywhere up and down the grid might find a loophole. They're even more difficult to find this time around than they were back when Brawn did it with a double diffuser, but that doesn't mean somebody might not have come up with something. Somebody might not have found a way to interpret rules that could deliver immediate performance. And that's one of the most exciting things going into the next era of this sport. So I can't wait. I'm really excited about all of that. We haven't got over the drama of this season yet, and we're already getting excited about next. Formula One's in a good place, isn't it, right now? Right. Well, look, I want to read this out, not to massage my own ego, but from João Nobrega. Marc, thank you for all your contribution over the year, covering all aspects of this season. It's been priceless. And the reason I'm reading that out, thank you, first of all, João, I really appreciate that. I have enjoyed this probably way more than any of you have. These Monday night sessions are the only thing that I've managed to hang on to in recent months with this channel because life outside has become so busy. I wasn't able to continue making the daily content or the weekly videos that I loved making. And by the way, go back, check out the back catalogue. There's loads of stuff there if you're new around here. I haven't been able to keep that up, but I was desperate to keep something going, my connection to you guys, and this is it. And so I look forward to the Monday nights as much, if not more, than I know that some of you do because you tell me. So thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate all of you who come back week after week, who engage through the chat and the comments, both here, afterwards on social media. Hit me up anytime, with any questions, and I always try my best. I apologise to those of you this weekend who I just didn't manage to respond to because my phone has literally been on fire over the course of the last few days, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I didn't get to respond to everybody, but it doesn't mean I don't appreciate you all reaching out for comments and messages and questions. And I always try my best. So please keep that coming. Right, let's get a few more in. I know it's 10 o'clock, but shall we just crack on? Feel free to go if you have to. I'm gonna try and do a few more. We won't go on all night, but let's keep it going. Is the dungeon permanent? Is the dungeon permanent? No, I hope it's not permanent. This is not my dungeon. This is my house that's currently being renovated. It feels like it's permanent right now, but I presume there'll be an end point at some point next year. But this is what we got. So this is my studio for now. Right, Kimi. Let's talk about Kimi. I want to say something about Kimi because obviously his race ended in a very disappointing way yesterday, but it didn't really matter, did it? That wasn't, whatever happened to Kimi yesterday was in no way reflective of his career. He's had an amazing career in Formula One. 20 years is just unbelievable to be at the top level of a sport. And I know he had a gap in the middle, but what an amazing guy. I was very fortunate, as you know, to have worked with him in the entirety of his spell at McLaren, which I firmly believe were his peak years. And I know he won the championship at Ferrari when he left, but his peak years for me were the mid-2000s, when he was a driver that's, and you'll know this if you've read my book, but he could drag a lap time out of a car that just didn't deserve to have that lap time dragged out of it. You know, he was the dream to work with, in that he was low maintenance, he was incredible fun. And yes, those who only see the snippets of Kimi with a microphone being jammed under his nose on a race weekend, he was an amazing fun. Outside of the car, even inside of the car, some of his radio messages that, you know, as you know from the ones that have been broadcast in recent years, I can promise you the ones that never got broadcast were equally as funny, if not more so, back in the day. He was a brilliant, brilliant guy. And best of all about Kimi, yes, he was an amazing racing driver, particularly in his peak, but he was an amazing human being. He was a brilliant, brilliant person who, you know, I formed a really tight bond with. We all did on his car. You know, the group of mechanics and engineers were in that period were the tightest group that I've ever worked with in motorsport. You know, we would have literally gone to war for each other. We did on occasions. We would have done anything for each other. And I firmly put Kimi in that. I think he would have done anything for us. And on many occasions he did. He looked after us just as we looked after him. So to see him go on, and even after he left us, to win the championship, and even though he won that championship in 2007 at the detriment of my two drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, there was a huge part of me that was just overwhelmed with emotion for Kimi. His lifelong dream had come true, and it was thoroughly deserved. So, you know, yes, the latter stages of his career have been disappointing in terms of we haven't seen the best of him. He's been down the back of the grid in a car that's been uncompetitive. But, you know, he's been a character that this sport will sorely miss. There is an argument to say there are a lot of drivers on this grid today who are sort of robotic and very corporate mouthpieces for their big, you know, corporations, sponsors, partners. Kimi's not one of those guys, and it may be some time before we get another one. So it was great to see him, you know, keep his career going for so long, to love being behind the wheel, even if he hated everything else about it. And I know that he will be making the most of retirement. I know that he's very comfortable with the decision he's made. He knows it's the right decision. He's a family man now. He's got kids, of course, and he's massively enjoying watching his kids grow up, encouraging them through a potential route into motorsport, which you may well see a Raikkonen at some point on the grid at some point in the future, who knows. But he's got a bright retirement ahead of him, and thoroughly deserved. So there are my views on Kimi. Antonio Giovinazzi, you know, utterly a nice guy. I mean, the things that he said and did over the course of this weekend that had so much respect for Kimi, held himself with the utmost grace, even though it must be very difficult for him. A, he's been dropped by the team, and B, his Formula One career came to an end on the same weekend as Kimi's. He was in the shadows all weekend. The whole focus was on Kimi, and yet, you know, you got to feel for the fact that that Antonio was walking away from this sport, at least for now, at the same time, and yet didn't get anywhere near the attention. It was a little bit like when Fernando Alonso left McLaren, of course, because, you know, on that particular day he got all of the attention, didn't he? And yet his poor young teammate got very little, who was also leaving on the same day. So similarities I felt there, but yeah, respect to Antonio Giovinazzi. I hope he does well in Formula E next year, but massive respect to Kimi, because he's a great driver and a great man. Right, where else should we go before we wrap this up? Other teams are helping Mercedes with appealing in court. Well, as I said, the decision, and let's bring it back to what happened yesterday to perhaps round things up. Claire Priestley says it's beer o'clock. That is a call from the missus to say, get back over here, you've had your time. It's not beer o'clock, it is whiskey o'clock tonight, but thanks, darling, I'll be over shortly. Let's bring this back and wrap this up with, back to where we started really, because as somebody just pointed out there, this wasn't just this decision that Michael Massey made and the race control made and the way the controversy played out wasn't just about the two title protagonists in terms of the outcome, in terms of the effect that that decision had. And it's no wonder that other teams have an argument, as well as Mercedes, to be disgruntled here. I've talked about how Carlos Sainz has a very good argument to be disgruntled too. And the unlapped cars, or the lapped cars rather, that weren't allowed to unlap themselves, could equally, in a sporting context, if this was any other race, be massively aggrieved. We shouldn't treat it like any other race. This should be just a motor race. It happened to be the last race of a season, and the stakes were higher than perhaps at some other races. The outcome of this race, in the end, decided the outcome of a championship because they went into it level on points. But the season as a whole is what really determined this championship, and the decisions that were made in yesterday's race affected way more than just Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. And that's the bigger picture, and that's the reason why we need to make sure nothing like this can ever happen in the sport again. Because this is a sport where typically 20 competitors in terms of drivers take to the field of play and expect to operate in a rules framework where they can make decisions, where they can base their decisions on the fact that they've studied the rule book, they know what's coming. Yes, there's going to be some interpretation to that, but when that interpretation comes, it cannot ever just be based on two guys at the front of the field and allowing them to fight, whether it's a championship decider or not. There are 20 drivers who need to get equal treatment when it comes to decisions being made, and that didn't happen yesterday. And for me, that's the biggest of all the controversies, and therefore I am not surprised that it's not just Mercedes who might feel disgruntled here. It's not just Mercedes that might have a really strong argument when we come to unpicking all of this through a tribunal or a court of appeal or wherever it finally ends up. It's going to end up with lawyers battling on both sides, which is messy. It's not graceful in any way. We had the world's eyes watching Formula One in a bigger way than we have done for many, many years. In the UK, the race went out free to air on Channel 4 as well as on Sky. The biggest audience we've had for a Grand Prix for a long time. It had been built up into such a crescendo of an epic season, and yet it's going to end up in a courtroom days later, still with a question mark over the way the race and the championship ended. And that's horribly messy for Formula One. It's not a good look. Yes, of course, we're going to be talking about this for days, and there's an argument to say that Formula One will embrace that. They'll take the attention that comes from all of that. But this is a sport. It should be an elegant sport. It should be the pinnacle of motor racing, and that should not just encompass the drivers and these elite teams, but it should also encompass the rules, the referees, the governing body, and the people controlling all of that. That's my take on it. I am going to wrap it up there because Mrs. P is shouting from across the other side of the house. Listen, thank you so much to all of you for all of your opinions. Thank you to all of you for keeping it clean tonight. I started the show by saying let's keep it respectful. In the most part, you know, I can see that that's happened. So I appreciate all of that. You know, you're a great bunch, you lot. This is a brilliant little community we have here, and I really appreciate you all coming along. The season's over. We will be back. I will be back, if you fancy it, next week to talk about the season as a whole. Let's try and round it off next Monday night. Today was about a particular race. It was about two particular drivers. Let's next week talk about the season, what happened, what we can reflect on, and maybe let's look ahead to the 2022 season and the changes that are coming, the driver swaps and all the rest of it. So if you're up for it, let's meet back here 9 p.m. next Monday night. In the meantime, have a wonderful week. Thank you again, and I will see you all very, very soon. Ta-da.